ဒီငလင်ကြီးလောက်ခတ်ခဲ့တာရပ်ပေါင်း20ကျော်ကြာရှိပြီပေါ့နော်ဒီကနေ့ဧပြီလ18ရက်နေ့ထိ DBB data တင်းကနေမြန်မာစံတော်ချိန်ညနေ9:00နာရီထိကောက်ယူထားတဲ့စီးနေရဆိုရင်ငလင်ကြောင့်ထိခိုက်ဒေဆုံးသူဦးရေက4410နဲ့ထိခိုက်ဒဏ်ရာရရှိသူက11,000နဲ့မှ366ရှိလို့သိရပါတယ်။ဒါကတော့ကျွန်တော် DBB data တင်းကနေလက်လန်းမီတလောက်ရရှိထားတဲ့စီးနေဖြစ်ပြီးတော့မြေပြင်မှာတော့ကိန်းဂဏန်းဒီထက်ပိုပြီးတော့ရှိနေနိုင်ပါတယ်။
But the quake-ravaged region is still experiencing powerful aftershocks as relief efforts continue in the worst affected areas.
International workers are trying to deliver aid, but fighting continues between the military and pro-democracy forces despite a ceasefire. NHK heard from people surviving in hard-hit areas.
At Insight Myanmar, we see our platform as more than a podcast. Through storytelling, interviews, and shared experiences, we're dedicated to amplifying the voices of Myanmar's people and their allies in the fight for justice, dignity, and human rights. In that sense, it's part of a broader movement and something of a bridge connecting a global audience to the heart of Myanmar's struggle. By engaging with diverse perspectives, activists, artists, scholars, and everyday citizens, we strive to create a ripple effect of awareness and change, empowering individuals to join a global community dedicated to supporting Myanmar's future.
And welcome back in our continued coverage of the Myanmar earthquake and the systematic political and infrastructural issues that have exacerbated this. We are joined today by Dean, who is going to be giving us an unparalleled insight into what I would say is Myanmar's capacity, but really it's Myanmar's lack of capacity and the reasons for that to adequately respond to this crisis. So before we get into that, Dean, thank you very much for joining us. And I want to give you the chance to introduce yourself for our audience more completely.
Thank you for having me today. First and foremost, I would like to share a quick disclaimer. The views I express in this conversation are my own and do not represent the positions or opinions of the organization I work for. My name is Dean Kyne, and I'm a full professor and disaster study program director at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley.
Okay. And let's just jump straight on into this. Obviously, we're dealing with an enormous crisis, and Myanmar is not sort of going through the first crisis. We know that Bagan, for example, has been hit with 3 major earthquakes. Remember Cyclone Nargis in 2008. This is a country that has faced a lot of natural disasters. What is Myanmar's capacity to deliver aid to affected communities and to respond to the acute needs of a natural disaster?
Yes, absolutely. This is a very good question. I think, in my opinion, I don't think Myanmar has a capacity or a willingness, to distribute the aids to the affected area. So, to better understand the disaster response in Myanmar, it is important to first recognize the country has been under the military rule for the better part of the last 6 decades. Military regimes, both past and present, have prioritized control and political power over the public welfare. And this dynamic has significantly influenced how disasters are managed, or in many cases, mismanaged. Um, as you know, Myanmar is geographically prone to a wide range of natural hazards, including cyclones, floods, landslides, and most recently, earthquakes. One of the most catastrophic events in the country's recent history was the Cyclone Nargis in 2008. Nargis struck the Aoridi Delta and Yangon division with the sustained winds over 130 miles per hour, leading to the deaths of an estimated 138,000 people. It was a humanitarian catastrophe of massive proportions. And what is particularly tragic is that many of these deaths could have been prevented. Several studies, including one by the Australian researchers, pointed out that Burmese authorities could have had as much as 72 hours notice of the incoming cyclone. In fact, India officially warned the Myanmar 48 hours before the landfall. Yet the junta failed to communicate this threat effectively to the population. I was actually a graduate student at Penn State University at that time, and I remember vividly following the news. I was tuned into Voice of America, and the anchor was interviewing the Director General of the country's meteorological station. When asked what kind of public preparation was needed for a storm, packing winds over 130 miles per hour, the response was, quote, "You could fix the roof." That moment stuck with me. It revealed the tragic disconnect between the government's understanding or perhaps willingness to communicate the severity of the disaster and the actual level of risks facing the population. Um, Here, it is also worth noting that the junta was conducting a constitutional referendum at that time instead of postponing it in light of the impending disaster. They choose to downplay the severity of the storm. This political prioritization came at an enormous human cost: the lack of transparent risk communication, failure to active management, active emergency management protocols, and refuse to accept international aid in early days all contributed to the devastating outcomes. So, when we talk about the disaster response in Myanmar, we can't separate it from the authoritarian context. Disaster governance is ultimately about saving lives, but under the junta, it has been en- entangled with the politics, secrecy, and control. Nagi is a heartbreaking example of how state failure can magnify the impacts of the disaster into full-blown humanitarian crisis. When we look into the hunters' response to this recent earthquake, one of the most troubling aspects was a heavy restriction placed on search and rescue operations. These limitations severely delay life-saving efforts in most critical hours after the disaster. Um, for example, a Singaporean rescue team was reported denied access to the Sagai region, where nearly the entire city had collapsed and countless people were trapped under the rubble. Instead of facilitating immediate help, the military imposed strict curfews that prevented both local and international teams from entering the affected areas. In any disaster, the first 24 to 72 hours are vital. Every minute can mean the difference between life and death. But in this case, those early hours were unnecessarily lost due to the junta restriction. There were multiple reports of such a rescue operation being delayed or obstructed, not because of the logistic challenges, but because of a lack of cooperation and support from the military authorities. One particular heartbreaking example is the experience of Kiran Verma, an Indian humanitarian responder and founder of Simply Blood, who traveled to Myanmar as part of Operation Bahama, Indians relief effort that includes a 80-member National Disaster Response Force team, medical staff, and supplies. He couldn't even reach to the hardest hit areas like Sagai. He was stopped in Mandalay by military authorities, and despite having the skill, the will, and the support to help, he was blocked at the gunpoint from proceeding further. In his own words, he couldn't bear the witness people dying while rescuing efforts were deliberately restricted. His account, reported by the Democratic Voice of Burma, underscored not only the junta's failures to act, but the active obstruction of those trying to save lives. This is not just about logistic failure, it is about humanitarian suppression under the authoritarian rules. Unfortunately, this reflects a broader pattern when the regime prioritizes control over coordination, even in times of urgent humanitarian needs.
And so I know that you touched on this, but I think it's a very important question to pose. In the wake of Nargis, which I think many of us view the response to Nargis as emblematic of a military that was not prepared to handle disaster management and was very concerned, as you say, with maintaining control. But the logical next step, to my mind, and I think to many people's minds, is for the military to start building domestic capacity for disaster relief so that when another disaster happens, they will not be embarrassed in the same way. They will not be unable to provide aid. They will not have to, in their minds, make a decision between delivering humanitarian aid and maintaining control over the country. And yet it seems that that did not happen. And indeed, it seems that if any progress was made under the NLD government as well, and I don't know how much would have been made in that time, right now it seems that that is not helping the current situation. So the big question here is, after such an enormous catastrophe like Nargis, why did we not see a focus on building domestic capacity to do disaster relief?
That is really a good question. What I think is that the government doesn't have a plan. Under the authoritarian rule, the control of the power is much more important than the public welfare. And in the rest, when there is a disaster hit, the ultimate goal of managing disaster is to save the lives and minimize the injuries and damage to the properties and human environments. That is the ultimate goal. Every organization share during the disaster, or every government share has set that goal in the disaster management efforts. But under the authoritarian regime, I don't see any evidence of having that goal. And their goal is to weaponize the disaster and to have them enhance their power and control over the country. So when you don't have that ultimate goal, it is quite difficult, to put the thoughts to plan, to build the capacity to better prepare, mitigate, respond, and recover from the disaster.
Mm.
That is the reason that we don't see the government doesn't consider, or the military junta doesn't consider um, uh, building capacity to effectively cope with managing disasters.
And I wonder if you're able to give us a sort of parallel view here under a system of government that would have been preparing for disaster management, a government that would be interested in minimizing the loss of human life, in minimizing infrastructural damage, in mitigating the secondary harm that comes from these disasters. What would be the difference? What would we be seeing in Myanmar under a government that is focused on protecting its people compared with what it is that we are seeing right now?
So the first thing, after this earthquake, you will be seeing, search and rescues. The local professional search and rescue team will be reaching out to those places.
Mhm.
The second, um, the the military junta will be dispatching, the search and rescue workers, their military personnel, their police, and also other, volunteers, to help those search and rescue efforts in order to save the lives and minimize injuries. And and second, what you will be seeing is that helicopters will be flying over those, areas, bringing those people, injured or just pulled out from the debris. They will be, immediately dispatched to the hospital depending on their medical needs. Um, we don't see those kind of immediate response because the government doesn't have that particular goal.
Mm. I mean, yeah, it's very sad. And so you mentioned right there local search and rescue teams. And I wonder then if we look at not the national federal level of response, but if we look at local levels in the wake of things like earthquakes and Cyclone Nargis and so on, and understanding that the government, especially under the military regime, is not particularly eager to help people, and we saw this very horrifically during the COVID period as well after the coup. Um, has there been any development in local capacity and local resilience to disasters, even without the national level governmental assistance?
So I don't see any activities, that focus on building local capacity to better prepare and mitigate, uh, respond and recover from a disaster um, after the pandemic or even uh, previous military regimes. The only observation during the civilian government under the NLD was having a plan to establish, local emergency operation centers, EOC, and also emergency management plan. Um, these were like an initial, development, uh, to build stronger local capacity in order to respond to disasters. Sadly, after the 2021 coup, it was gone.
Yeah, yeah. And so let's then look at what is actually happening from the military regime at the moment. We've heard so many different things. Some of them probably true, some of them probably exaggerated, but it seems like the military, number one, is only actively engaged in rescue operations and relief operations in territories that they consider to be firmly under their control. So, for example, within Naypyidaw. And number two, it seems that the military is actively trying to prevent some of the rescue operations and relief operations. So we'll focus on the first one first. Is the military engaged in any sort of rescue and relief operations? And if they are those operations restricted to the territories that they see as under their control completely?
So in my observation, I don't see their active engagement in the response, even in the areas, where they have a complete control.
Mhm.
It was very sad to see their aid distribution, that there were also corrupt practices. Um, uh, they distributed, but the person who is in charge in the village or the city, they corrupt and they resell and repurpose the aids. So the victims didn't receive the necessities, from the aid distribution. Um, and in the affected areas, in the other areas, that was under the resistant group control. Even local NGO organization, if they would like to travel and distribute their donation, their supplies, they were blocked, and the checkpoint were very long, and they couldn't reach to those areas. So they ignore, distributing aids to those areas under the resistant group.
I just want to clarify here because this is quite interesting with the corrupt aid distribution practices. We do hear a lot of stories of the military intercepting international aid or the military intercepting even domestic aid that was raised or that was going to be delivered through non-military controlled organizations and networks, like intercepting that and then selling it for profit. Are you saying, however, that there were cases where the military was trying to distribute aid themselves and local authorities who are corrupt were taking even the military's aid? Is that correct?
Well, yes. The First of all, the aid distribution is at the minimal level,
Mm,
and we don't see, in public or or the evidence of distributing the aids. The second, when they distribute um, at the minimal amount, there was also corruption involved. Um, those, the the leaders, in the communities, they are supporters of the military junta, so um, they have a corrupt practices. They steal those aids, they resell for their profit, and they didn't distribute to the um, affected people.
wow. And so I want to look at the actual what we might call sabotage here, and the cases that we've heard rumors of, and I wonder whether you can give us any examples and tell us what is true and what is not true. We've heard stories that, of course, as you say, aid is being intercepted and stolen. We've heard stories of aid workers, legitimate, recognized professional aid workers, being forcibly redirected away from the places where they wanted to be delivering aid. We've heard that in some places there is a curfew in effect that is preventing aid workers from working during the night, even while people are trapped in buildings. And we've heard that the military are forcibly recruiting some volunteer workers into the military. Of these cases, do you know whether any of these are true? And if they are true, do you know how big the scope is?
Yes, this is a good question, and this is the current issues is um, after the disasters people are facing, and the aid workers, they, as I mentioned before, there were evidences that they are not uh, allowed to move freely. There were a lot of restrictions, and also uh, um, and sometimes they will be forced, places not to go if those are places under the control by the resistant groups. Um, and also, um, the volunteers, the male volunteers, they are also vulnerable to be forced to enter into the military because, they are lack of um, uh, forces, so they are trying to force the volunteers to recruit. So you can find those evidences, many reports, by the reliable medias, it is very sad. The um, devastation, uh, created by the military after the disasters have led to many compounded, disasters, um, and now people are really facing the humanitarian crisis situation.
Hmm. And so I want to clarify though, specifically on the cases of forced recruitment. Do we have any number for that? Do we have any concept or scope for how many people might have suffered that?
So, for, for, for me, for my observation, I don't have exact numbers, but I think the reports seem like uh, the scope has been very wide,
Mm,
and because they need badly to recruit their new military members.
mm, fair enough. The other one is I've heard a report from Mandalay regarding an organization that you're probably quite familiar with, the Pew Sortie, who are a paramilitary organization that, to my understanding, has successfully intimidated aid workers for I'm not entirely certain why they would do this. My understanding is they suspected the aid workers of being connected with revolutionary organizations. uh, I would like to better understand this and what knowledge we have of this situation. Is it the case that non-military, so technically civilians who are ideologically in support of the military, are engaging in intimidation tactics against uh, rescue workers and relief workers?
Um, I think the public and civilians who are not a member of the Pew Sortie, um, they have great appreciation for helping them. They have expressed, gratefulness and thanks to many international communities, who provided the aid, who sent the search and rescue teams. So that is the attitude and mindset of the public. However, the Busati group has a different mindset. Um, you know, they 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 disrupt the distribution of aids, to the public, that do not support the military junta, and they would like to suppress, people who do not support, who do not show support to the military. So that is what we are seeing now, and they are the a big source of destruction. to the aid distribution as well. This is another layer.
But this is very difficult to understand because the Pusoti are civilians, and so if they are intimidating aid workers and they are intimidating rescue workers, the logical conclusion is that they are intimidating those who are attempting to help the members of their own local communities. Unless they're traveling very far in order to carry out these intimidation operations, they would be causing further harm within their own communities, possibly causing the suffering and the death of people that they personally know and they personally have lived alongside. It's a little bit difficult to understand why a person would do something like that. Do you have any insight into this mindset?
So what I view them is not the general public. I view them as like a plaintiff of the military regime, um, army. And this is just a different uniform. So their mindset is the same as a military who doesn't care the welfare of the public.
I mean, it's horribly depressing to see people working against aid possibilities and aid workers. So let's then turn away from the domestic capacity and let's look at the international capacity. And I want to give you a bit of lateral freedom to tackle this issue as you see fit. The way that I perceive this is that there are three major questions with regard to the international community's ability to provide aid. The first question is the pragmatic question: what sort of aid can be offered that would genuinely be beneficial to the people of Myanmar right now? The second question is political: how can that aid be offered? And is it possible to offer the aid in a way that does not strengthen the military and that does not become subject to the military's capacity to manipulate the aid? And the third question, perhaps the most difficult question, is the moral dimension. To what extent should the international community, or could the international community, take it upon themselves to say, these people are suffering and we have a responsibility to help them? And if the military is going to try and make that difficult for us, we have a responsibility to find alternative methodologies through which we can help these people, regardless of what the military wants. But I want to give you the space to discuss this topic in whatever way you see appropriate.
All right. Thank you. So the first question is, what would be the best, offer to give uh, public during this disaster event, after the disaster event? So I think, um, you know, uh, you need to understand the context of this particular country, which is really complex. As I mentioned about the authoritarian government context, that is really uh, uh, lack of the focusing on the public welfare, and also lack of the ultimate goal for disaster and emergency management. And also one more thing that I would like the international community to understand is that this kind of disaster is will require a lot of efforts and resources to fully recover. And it will be like many years, maybe even more than 10 years, to fully recover. So there are not only the aids, for the basic necessities, but also we need to consider about rebuilding, the public infrastructures, the properties, this is also very important to look at and consider how the international communities could contribute to rebuilding, Myanmar after this Sakai earthquake. And nowadays, when you look at people needs not only food and shelters, but also in the immediate response, the initial clearing of debris are very crucial, and people could not afford. And it is really costly to remove. In a normal government in a developed countries, they're clearing the debris on the streets and sidewalks will be fully responsible by the government. But now people have to struggle how to remove those debris by themselves. So these are the things to consider about in the process of responding and rebuilding, in the long-term, short-term recovery, long-term, short-term period. There will be different needs, and also resources they will need. So I think that that is very important dimension to consider among the international donors, international communities, when you are distributing the aid. Now, when you look at the Burma, the military doesn't control the entire nation. And the military controls only 20% of the nation. And the revolutionary groups have control like 80% of the countries. So it is very important to distribute to those, different groups of different political groups, who is also in charge recently in their control areas. That way, the aids can be distributed more effectively, and making sure that the aids can reach to the people who are affected by the disasters, and also people who are facing the economic hardship, like UN recently published reports. Half of the population, is living under the 67 cents per day, and they estimated like about 60 million population requiring the urgent needs, urgent humanitarian aid. So that needs to be taken into consideration to politically, distribute, the aid, not only at the one hand of the military regime. The last question, I guess, it was the moral or ethical aspect of the aid distributions. So when you look at the disasters, depending on the scale and impacts, people, especially those who are in the developing countries, they lack resources, they lack the government supports, And I think the current earthquake has an unimaginable impacts and skill. Before the disaster, then people are in a extreme poverty condition, and government doesn't have any concern about the public welfare, just concern about their power and control and weaponizing the disasters. In such a situation, the other countries needs to consider seriously the human aspects of the disasters. We all cannot ignore, you know. So, referring to my recent research studies, the world is trying to achieve the sustainable goals, SDGs. There are 17. We have been working hard in order to achieve those goals. But the previous disasters during the past 20 years have reversed the progress of those goals, especially the disasters. They impact on the poverty and resiliency. So if we don't help to rebuild after the disaster, build back better, I believe the world cannot achieve sustainable development goals as we wish. And the country like Myanmar, where we in the poverty situation, if they do not receive the health, they do not receive the support, to build back better, and they couldn't achieve their political goals, where the freedom and human rights are granted it under the democratic governance.
And specifically on this development front, because I know that this is something that you've written about in the past, the impact of the natural disasters on a country's ability to develop. Myanmar, I think from 2010 to 2020, Myanmar did incredible things to make progress with regards to development, whether it was technological development or infrastructural development, and just generally opening up and trying to match pace with her neighbors. But natural disasters are not really something that we can completely prevent. They're not something that we can control. What impact do natural disasters themselves, and what impact does the efficiency of government response to natural disaster have on a country's ability to continue developing in the long term?
Yes, you are absolutely right. We can't control. All the natural disasters are unavoidable. I think Myanmar is geographically prone to natural disasters, including cyclones, flood, landslides, earthquakes. But we can minimize the vulnerability, reduce the disaster risks, and build the resilience communities to better prepare, mitigate, respond, recovery. With that, the ultimate goal of managing natural disaster to minimize to save the lives and to minimize the injuries, loss of properties, and minimizing damage to the human environments that can be achieved when we can build the resilience communities, better preparing for the future disasters. We can still minimize the losses and damage and achieve the ultimate goal.
Absolutely. And on this topic, like now we are currently faced with a military that clearly is not interested in delivering aid. And with a country so broken and fractured and divided and affected by conflict, it is not, I think, feasible to expect a national level resiliency to natural disasters. And we touched on community resiliency earlier in this interview, and I believe you said that you haven't seen any real community level resilience activities, community level development into disaster capacity. Is there anything that you think local levels can do, whether this is individual communities or whether it's geographic regions that have at least some stability at the moment and might be controlled by a single organization? Is there any capacity for this lower level unit to build capacity to start preparing for natural disasters, to start making themselves more resilient to natural disasters? Is that a possible step that could help mitigate future disasters?
Absolutely, absolutely, it is possible. But since the military regime doesn't have any concern, any attention to the public welfare, I don't think the any government related organization may not be feasible to begin with. So I think the non-government organizations at the local level, they can first educate the public, um, they informing about the potential risks of their geographic specific disasters risks,
Mm,
and teaching them how to prepare them, you know, how
mm,
to respond, how to recover. And one example could be like um, uh, uh, community emergency response team, CERT, this is like very popular volunteering local emergency management teams in US. So they can also uh, train those volunteers, to be uh, professionally trained volunteers in case they will be the first responders to their communities members, and they don't need to wait for national, state, responders to reach to their impacted area. So this is the best way to begin with, after this disaster. And I think NGOs should be funded, to conduct these kind of activities, in the community levels.
mm. And I think that's really interesting because when we think of capacity building, when we think of resiliency, first and foremost, what we think about is shelters, stockpiles of food, stockpiles of medicine, setting up physical facilities that cost a lot of money and require a lot of stability, peacetime stability to actually build safely. But you've pointed out a very important thing here. Education alone is incredibly valuable in this endeavor. Is this do you think it's possible to carry out education and training even through platforms like Zoom, for example, so that it can be delivered even safely during a time of conflict? Is there capacity for this?
All right. So I think that distant learning, virtual learning is also possible.
Hmm.
I think in this kind of training, I think we need to have like a training of trainers, first. So we need to produce those local trainers, by the uh, professionals, trainers. And once we get those, local trainers, those local trainers can retrain their local community members. So I think you are question of utilizing the online technology is feasible, and given that nowadays the link internet is also available in those areas where internet is not available provided by the state.
Fascinating. So that opens up a very interesting opportunity and a very interesting possibility for building community development. So I wanna thank you for coming on. I want to thank you for sharing the insights that you've shared with us. I think it's very difficult in times like this when there are so many things happening simultaneously in so many parts of the country, and everyone is focused on immediate concerns. It's very difficult to get a clear picture and a clear long-term picture. And so we're very lucky to have someone like you who can put things into perspective for us.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity for the final thoughts. And I would like to say, the people in Myanmar, you have to be very strong. And for the international community members, please continue with what you have been doing, and please support to the FEDEF individuals members.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast. Producing these conversations takes dedication and resources, and through this process, we're committed to keeping them freely available for everyone. But to make this work sustainable, we do need your help. If you've enjoyed this episode or found it valuable, and if you listen to our platform on any somewhat regular basis, we ask you to consider supporting us with a recurring donation. It doesn't have to be much. Think of it as buying us a cup of coffee each month. That small gesture of committing to just, $5 a month can make a big difference in helping us to continue bringing these stories. And if you're feeling more generous, increasing the monthly pledge will allow us to produce even more on our end. In any case, any level of support goes directly towards amplifying the voices and stories that matter. This not only keeps us going, but ensures that these important conversations reach more people around the world. To make a contribution, visit insightmyanmar.org/donation or look for Insight Myanmar on PayPal or Patreon.
Nangaya unyana dadu ya danam dari gane zadu mana wigara besaya na besaya oba yarana da yarana ngana yarana ya da yarana boda ba yarana